officials of Oxford Africa Society, distinguished guests, fellow Africans, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Africa hoy! Africa hoy! Thank you very much. I feel very delighted to have an opportunity to come back here to Oxford to talk to you today. I'm saying so because it's not my first time to be in Oxford. I have an occasion to come here and talk before. And this is the time I actually welcome this opportunity because of special circumstances prevailing on the continent today. Let me begin by introducing to my colleagues who have accompanied me here. I'm here with Honorable Edwin Sifuna, who is a senator. He's a senator in Kenyan Parliament, but also the Secretary General of Orange Democratic Movement, the party that I lead. Also accompanying me here is Honorable Jared Okello, a member of Parliament in the National Assembly of Kenya, representing a constituency known as Nyando. I'm also accompanied by my Director of Communications, Mr. Dennis Onyango. He's up there. So we are happy to join you here today. And let me begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to share ideas at this annual intellectual event, which is focused on Africa, the cradle of human civilization. Africa is also the cradle of mankind because by contemporary scientific knowledge, the oldest species of humanoids are found in Africa, particularly in the eastern part of Africa, which says that for Christians, Adam was an African. I will state the bottom line up front by using what many may think is a cliche, but is central to my life's work. I am an African and an Afro-optimist. Africa is my business. Simply put, animating vision throughout my life has been hashtag African Lives Matter. Some of you may not be Africans, but I assure you, Africa is your business too. And I've said I'm an Afro-optimist as opposed to Afro-pessimist. Afro-pessimists are those who have given up on Africa, who say Africa is a lost cause, hopeless cause. Afro-optimists are those who believe in the ability of the African people to develop Africa, like myself. I belong to the school of the late Osagyefo, Kwame Nkrumah. I have experienced Africa through generations and lived through its best and dreams and the worst nightmares. I have witnessed Africa's committed political leadership with the long-term visions espoused by the continent's fathers like Nnamdi Azikiwe, Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Ahmed Sekou Toure, Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Oginga Odinga, Gamal Abdel Nasser, to say a few, and more recently, Nelson Mandela. I have also lived to witness the collapse of that grand vision. I have advocated for democracy and human rights in my own native Kenya my entire life, and have helped to bring calm to several African states that were dancing on the precipice. I was in Burundi, I was in Mozambique, I was in Cote d'Ivoire, mediating conflict in those countries. I served as the African Union Commission High Representative for Infrastructure Development in Africa, as you have been told, between 2018 to 2023. That gave me the opportunity to further appreciate Africa's myriad infrastructural and associated challenges. My conversation with you today is therefore divided into two. One, how did we get ourselves into the current situation of deferred dreams? And two, how do we get ourselves out of it? My children often chide me whenever I get into history, but I promise not to spend too long here. One of Africa's most phenomenal post-colonial leaders, Felix Houphouët-Boigny of Cote d'Ivoire, said, and I quote, "We have all inherited from our former masters, not nations but states, states that have within them extremely fragile links between ethnic groups," unquote. That was partly the beginning of our deferred dreams. The most difficult task that faced Africa's new leaders was to wield into nations a variety of different peoples speaking different languages and at different stages of political and social development. That colonial past continues to weigh heavily on Africa, but it is not the only problem. I believe that the greatest hindrance to Africa's aspirations has been disunity and our inability to mobilize our resources for the collective drive of the continent's citizens. You may be aware that I am running to be the chairman of the African Union Commission. My candidature comes from a pivotal time in the continent's multifaceted transitions. We are beset by threats of reversal of democratic gains and internal social disorder, economic marginalization, and external insecurities. These can only be addressed by a fit-for-purpose African Union. When I was here last time in 2018, I shared my optimism for Africa. Earlier, The Economist magazine had referred to Africa as the hopeless continent, and I appealed to the world to discard and disregard that mindset. My optimism stands vindicated. Africa has continued its upward trajectory. In February, the African Development Bank reported that Africa will account for 11 of the world's 20th fastest growing economies this year. The real gross domestic product, the GDP growth for the continent, is expected to average 3.8% and 4.2% in 2024 and 2025 respectively. This is higher than the projected global average of 2.9% and 3.2%. The continent is set to remain the second fastest growing region after Asia. We are in an age where almost 400 million Africans in Africa are on the internet. From Casablanca to Maseru, Africans, both urban and rural, are online, connecting, watching, creating, learning, and earning. The great disruptor known as the cell phone is doing for young Africans what governments and billions of dollars in debt could never achieve. It is allowing Africans to assemble, organize, speak, share their genius, and pull themselves out of poverty. Stories that would never be carried on BBC or CNN are live on TikTok. Products not found in the local Tesco or even Amazon are sold on Instagram. And Africans are deep in this. If this is not resilience, then nothing is. There is therefore a justifiable wave of optimism across Africa. We are not shy of talking about a possible African century. I believe that if we maintain the present trajectory and constantly make improvements, Africa should continue progressing in the years ahead. What exactly is the trajectory we need to sustain? Africa must unite. Continental integration with the dream of Azikiwe, Nkrumah, Nyerere, and Sekou Touré, among others. We must return to it, to the top of our priorities. If Africa continues to be disunited in a fast-changing world, it will continue to be marginalized, exploited, and irrelevant. How do we integrate? Through continental trade, open skies, open visas policies, and infrastructure. Secondly, we must treat the minds of our young people as our fundamental resource. Our challenge as leaders is to ensure that the quality of education you get here in Oxford is available in Africa. Then we must make the ever-changing technology, including that of artificial intelligence, AI, are available to our people. Thirdly, we must also strengthen cooperation with the global community on global issues, including trade, security, and climate change. I can report here that there is visible progress in these vital areas. Many ask, might things still go wrong? My answer is yes, and here is what I think we need to do. One, we must work extra hard to entrench democracy on the continent. We have 19 countries slated for presidential or general elections this year. How these elections go will have a huge bearing on how we proceed as a continent. Two, we must watch against the return of conflict and coups. We have had a civil war in Ethiopia, the humanitarian crisis in Tigray, coups and jihadist uprisings in the Sahel, and conflicts in the Sudans and the DR Congo. You've seen the coups in Mali, in Guinea, in Burkina Faso, in Niger, in Gabon. Three, Africa could, but must not be caught again in proxy wars between foreign powers, as happened during the Cold War. Four, we must pay greater attention to the issues of poverty and sharing of opportunities, which are at the heart of the conflicts in Africa. Five, we are witnessing a new scramble for Africa. China, Turkey, India, and the Gulf nations are increasingly asserting their own influence around the continent. Russia is making a return. The US and Europe remain active. While we need to engage with the world, Africa must find ways to navigate old and new geopolitical interests that often put it to great disadvantage. Sixth and last, there is climate change that has serious environmental, economic, and security implications. Africa must adequately prepare for disruption of livelihoods, including food production, new diseases, and consequent social upheavals and civil strife. These are things we all know are going to happen, and we cannot just sit and wait for them to devastate us. We need to learn to prepare instead of merely preparing to respond. We must do this collectively as a continent to deal with critical issues that affect more than one country. Overall, I remain confident that the transformation of Africa is underway and will continue. I'm encouraged by the determination of young global citizens such as yourselves to change the future of the continent and the world. I encourage you to continue being creative, far-sighted, and making demands of our leaders. Most of all, I encourage you to stretch your hands across borders and connect more with each other. Many of you are working on startups. I encourage you to look at what the cost of outsourcing to Africa would be. If each one of us tries just a little bit, it is that unified purpose that will finally bring about the African Renaissance. Thank you.
Honorable, thank you so much again for the talk. I really loved your point on Afro-optimism. And we actually have a question for you, and it's saying, what advice can you give young Afro-optimists working to change the narrative and overcome challenges of the hopeless continent stereotype? So that's one of the questions that we have, Kennedy. And while he's jotting that down, maybe you could also give him one question.
Yeah, and you also mentioned about the influences in Africa. There's a question on China, and the question says, what are your thoughts on the current Chinese influence in Kenya?
Yeah, those are great questions. So again, don't forget, you can just scan and then ask the questions, and we'll read them from here. So yeah, we'll give it to you, Honorable, to try and answer those two questions before we go on to the other questions that have come through. So the first one was, what word of encouragement you would give to the young Afro-optimists?
Well, so let's say I say that the Afro-optimists are those who believe in the ability of African people to develop Africa, not that Africa would be dependent on the external world. First, we must have confidence in ourselves as a people, and we must not continue to give excuses, because the usual common excuse is that, oh, we were poor because we were colonized. But I keep on saying that, yes, so what? India was also colonized. China was for a long time colony of Japan. Malaysia was a colony, and so on. So colonialism is past. What do we do among ourselves now as African people? Why do you have to depend on other people? First, self-confidence in the ability and capability of African people, that we are not inferior to any people, and that we need to help each other. Help your fellow African brother and sister when they are in problems, and try to promote more working among yourselves as a people, as a continent. And don't discriminate on the basis of ethnicity. Tribalism is a major problem in African countries. Then it translates eventually to nepotism, where people offer opportunities more to people of their own tribes and so on. This itself actually impedes growth and development, because we're not able to tap into the talent that we have as a people. So look at yourself as equal. And thirdly, the issue of gender equality is very important. We should discard the old traditions which tended to discriminate against the people of female gender. Give women equal respect and equal opportunities to serve like men. And also tap into the youth talent. Africa it has got what is called the youth bulge. It's the youngest continent in terms of population. The others, like now where we are in Europe, these are aging communities because they're not giving birth. Africa is young. 70% of the African population below the age of 35. So you can actually have a kind of what you call demographic dividend by empowering the youth. Because if the youth is not empowered, they become delinquents, drug addicts, criminals, and a drag on society. But if they are empowered, then they become a potent force for growth and development. That's what China has done. So this is some of the advice I would give to optimists. Going to China. China, this is a question always, is always the elephant in the room. China. But I say China is not a threat to Africa. Chinese have managed to do a wonder or a miracle in the latter half of last century. When they opened up their societies, first they had invested very heavily in manpower development. They had a fairly young and very skilled workforce. So when they opened up the economy, most of the corporations from the Western world rushed to China. China became the factory of the world. China was making things good. Name all these corporations. They're in China. You have got the Ford Corporation. You have got the Mercedes, Nissan, Toyota, Peugeot. All these are manufacturing in China. In Germany, they tell me that it is cheaper to manufacture a Mercedes-Benz in China and ship it back to Germany than the one that is manufactured in Stuttgart. Okay? So within that period of time, China managed to build the biggest middle class, 500 million people who moved from the lower class to the middle class. But because of that, China is no longer a cheaper destination for manufacturing because they have become more affluent. A gap that is down there, which Africa can fill. But China, it's true, China is interested in African raw materials. China wants iron ore, they want copper ore, they want bauxite, they want lithium, all these raw materials which are available in Africa for their industries. But Africa can actually also negotiate with China, negotiate on equal terms, so that we get our raw materials in exchange for ABCD. And what I've been saying is that nobody has prevented anybody else from coming to Africa. Nobody has prevented anybody from coming to Africa. Before China came in, we were there. African economies were dismissed as basically hopeless cases. You are basically hippies, highly indebted economies. So the US is welcome to Africa. UK, these are the countries which have African peers or colonial masters. Nobody has dismissed them. So Africa should just trade with everybody on equal terms. So China, in my view, is not a threat to Africa at all. China is threatening nobody. It's a partner like any other partners. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Honorable. Unfortunately, we are pressed for time, so we will not go through all the questions. But there's one question that keeps coming up, and I feel it would be wrong if we do not address it. During your talk, you mentioned that you are running for the position of AU chair. So maybe as your last words to us, how are you looking at integrating the continent? How do you intend to address the trade barriers that are currently existing? And if you were elected as AU chair, what would be your legacy?
Thank you. First, yes, I'm running for the position of chair of African Union Commission. First, I've been actually requested by some of my friends, but also feel challenged having been a high representative of AU on infrastructure development. You'll know that the AU actually now established African continental free area trade, which basically makes it possible and necessary for Africans to trade with itself. Africa, intra-African trade is very small. Inter-European trade stands at right now at 70%. Inter-Asian trade is at 50%. Even South America is standing at about 30%. But intra-African trade is just about 15% right now. Africa trade very little with itself. People will tell you that, oh, Africans don't trade with each other because they produce almost the same things. But you ask yourself, European countries produce almost the same things. How come they trade with each other? That is not the reason, that is the excuse. But having been the high representative of Africa on infrastructure, I understand. One of the impediments is non-tariff barriers to trade which have been imposed by respective African countries. Secondly, is lack of infrastructure between these African countries. And this actually makes it difficult for African countries to trade. I'll give you an example. Kenya, between Kenya and a country called Central African Republic, there's only one country called South Sudan, between Kenya and Central African Republic. But there's no infrastructure. There's no highway, there's no railway that connects Kenya to Central African Republic. So if you want to send goods to Central African Republic from Kenya, you have to find a ship that will go down the Cape Coast along the West African coast to Cameroon, and then by road into Central African Republic. The French are there ahead of you. And that's why they drink Kenyan tea in Bangi called English breakfast tea. Okay. So, so you need to have infrastructure. At the AU, we are addressing the following: the intra-African highways, the Cape to Cairo. This is a project which was conceived by Cecil Rhodes, after whom, in whose honor we are sitting here today. Cecil Rhodes is the one who conceived the idea of Cape to Cairo over 100 years ago. And he said that he wanted to travel by road from Cape Town to Cairo. That was his dream. Up to today, it has not been realized. There are still gaps in between that highway from Cape to Cairo. Then there is the road from Tunis to the Cape that goes along the western coast. Then there is the Dakar to Djibouti, the east, across the Sahel. Then the one Dakar to Lagos, then Lagos to Mombasa, the east coast, and several, those are Central African highways. Then there is a high-speed railway network. One of them is running from Lagos along the coast or western coast all the way to Cairo. Another one running from Beira in Mozambique to Walvis Bay in Namibia. Then another one is what we call LAPSET, the Lamu Port, South Sudan, and the Ethiopia Transport Corridor. But as the AU, we had extended it across the Central African Republic to the Cameroonian port of Kribi to create a land bridge that connects the Atlantic Ocean and Indian Ocean and open up the landlocked countries in the interior of the continent. Then we're also talking about open skies. Right now, air transport is too expensive across the continent of Africa because each country has got its own air traffic control system. If you want to travel across the continent, you have to get so many licenses. I give you an example. Just 2 months ago, I went to the funeral of the late president of Namibia. We chartered an aircraft to fly from Nairobi to Windhoek. We had to spend 3 hours waiting at the airport for air traffic clearance, transit control, to get from Tanzania airspace, DRC, Zambia, Botswana, and Namibia. At that time, I was holed up in Dar es Salaam for 10 hours. I was flying to Niamey in Niger for a conference on a charter. You have to get the clearance over Uganda, over DRC, over the Central African Republic, Nigeria, and Cameroon, Nigeria, and Niger. So this is the thing. We're talking about creating an open skies so that you have one African air traffic control, that's like you have in Europe here. That is one of the things. The other one is the fiber optic network connection, to connecting all the African capitals to make it easier for communication and make ICT available to the population of Africa, as you're saying. The other one is the water transport and the blue economy generally. Here we are talking about river transport. Like you want to connect the Mediterranean along the Nile to Lake Victoria, so that the ships can move from Europe through the Nile all the way to Lake Victoria in the Central Africa, also the Congo, making them navigable, and so on and so forth. This is another area where we want to work. And this will make it easier for goods to move across the continent. So what you're talking about is to make Africa first accessible, and second, to be able to attract investment. We don't want Africa to continue as a supplier of raw materials. We want Africa to do value addition to the raw materials that it produces, so that it can be able to produce manufactured products. And this will help to create jobs within the continent. You see, it is a paradox that Africa, the richest continent on planet Earth in terms of resources, is also the poorest. This is a paradox that we want to change and to improve the living conditions of the people of Africa. And I keep on talking about the African lion, the story of the African lion, and I will end my talk here with the story of the African lion. The African lion is talking to the Asian tiger and telling the Asian tiger that you have danced on the stage for far too long alone. The European bear retreated a long time to the poles and is asleep. The American panther is also limping, is on the retreat. But I mean, I've been asleep in the jungles of Africa for long, but now I'm awake. I'm awake, and I'm here bounded by the mountains, Kilimanjaro to the east, and Atlas to the west. The rivers, Nile, the Gambia, the Zambezi, the Limpopo, the Congo. And I am sitting in the African forest. I'm sitting in African gold, African bauxite, African iron ore, African diamonds. I will use my ability to transform all these raw materials into wealth and to claim the 21st century as a truly African century. Message from the African lion to Asian tiger. Thank you.
All right. All right.
Thank you so much.
All right. Honorable Odinga, thank you so much for gracing us with your presence, your insights on Afro-optimism, your insights on Chinese influence and the importance for critical negotiations in Africa, but also thank you for running for the AU as well. And I wish you good luck in your candidacy. Everyone.
Thank you.